Claude Code is a command line AI tool created by Anthropic that helps you build features, fix bugs, and review code based on your prompt instructions. It runs inside your terminal, and it has direct access to your files in your code base, which means that it can read your project files and understand how your project works before writing any code. To do that, at its core, Claude Code uses an LLM, which stands for Large Language Model. It's what allows Claude Code to understand language, reason through tasks, and give you relevant responses. This is the same kind of technology behind tools like ChatGPT and Gemini. However, what makes Claude Code different is that it does more than generating just code. It also comes with a variety of tools that allow it to interact with its environment. Now, when you combine an LLM with tools, that's when you get an AI agent. An AI agent, like Claude Code, is basically a system that can interact with its environment using the tools it has, while using an LLM to decide when and how to use the tools. To give you an example of how it usually goes, let's say you ask Claude Code to add a drag and drop file upload feature. The moment Claude Code receives the request, the LLM reasons about what it needs to implement the feature. And just to give an example, let's say it determines that it needs to install a library like Dropzone. Before it does that, it uses a tool to check whether the specific library is already installed in your project. Now let's say the LLM then sees that the library is not installed and decides to install it. So it uses a tool to run a command in your terminal to install Dropzone. And once that's done, the LLM then decides to implement the feature. And to do that, it uses a tool to create the upload component. And finally, the LLM gives you a final response that tells you that the feature is implemented. So this is just a simplified version of how Claude Code works, but basically it takes a goal, reasons about what needs to be done, and uses the available tools to accomplish the task. And that's what turns Claude Code from an LLM that just generates code into an agentic coding tool that can actually work with your code base. Alright, so in this lesson, we're going to install Claude Code so we can use it directly from our terminal. And the way you do that depends on your operating system. So I suggest you visit the documentation at this specific URL. And there you can find the exact command that you need to run in your terminal. So if you're on a Mac or Linux, you would have to use the first command. And if you're using Windows like me, you can either install it through PowerShell or command prompt. So just copy a command and then open your preferred terminal, paste it in, and run it. And this will install Claude Code on your machine. Now, if you're using Windows and you get a message saying that the local binary folder is not in your path, then you still need to add this path to your environment variables. And to do that, just copy it, and then in Windows search for environment variables, and click on Edit the System Environment Variables. And a new window should pop up. Down below, click on Environment Variables. Under User Variables, select Path, and click on Edit. And then click on New, and paste in the path. Next, click on OK. And now you should be able to run Claude from the terminal. However, if you just updated the path, make sure to open a new terminal. Otherwise, it won't be able to detect the new path. And after that, just run Claude. And if you're running it for the first time, you need to set up a few things first. So first of all, it asks you to choose a theme. So just choose whatever theme you like. Then it asks how you want to log in. And I think for most people that is via a subscription. So I'll just select that. And a browser window pops up. And here you need to authorize yourself with your Claude account. And once you do that, it should return a code. So just copy it. Then open the terminal and paste it in. Now, once you're logged in, just press enter and it shows some notes. So just press enter again. And then it asks whether you trust this folder. And if you press yes, then Claude Code will be able to read, edit, and execute files here. So yes, I trust this folder. And with that, Claude Code opens in the terminal and you can start using it right away. To take this course, I set up a simple project that you can clone so you can follow along with me. And you are free to use any project you like, but if you want to use the same project as me, just head to this GitHub link. Next, make sure you're on the starter branch and under code, copy this URL and clone the project. And once you've done that, just open the project in VS Code. Then open the terminal by pressing Ctrl plus backtick and run npm I to install all necessary dependencies. And once that's done, you can start the Vite server by running npm run dev. Then click on this link while holding the Control key, and it should open the app in the browser. Now, this project uses TanStack router, and for it to work properly, you need to configure a few settings. So just go to this link and scroll a bit down till you find these settings and just copy them. Then in VS Code, go to the File tab. Under Preferences, click on Settings. Next, open the settings in JSON format and paste in the settings. And once you're done, just close the settings and you can move on to the next lesson where we'll finally start using Claude Code. Now that we have everything set up, let's see how we can start our first Claude session. So go ahead and open the terminal. And since the Vite server is already running, we need to open a second terminal first. All right, now let's just run Claude. And we get the same safety check as before. So just select yes. And it starts a new session inside our project folder. And Claude can actually read and modify the files inside the folder. Now, if you have your terminal at the bottom, you're going to end up scrolling a lot, especially because the conversations can get pretty long. So what I recommend you do is right-click on the panel and under Panel Position, select Right. And this way you get a vertical panel, which is much easier to read. Now, if you have an extra monitor, you can also bring the panel back to the bottom. Then right-click on the Claude session and click on Move Terminal into New Window. And this way you get an entire window just for Claude. So use whatever works for you. I'll keep mine in a separate window so everything is easy to read if you're watching this on a smaller device. All right, now as a first prompt, let's just say, give me a brief overview of this project. And let's just send the prompt. And it will read the project files. And once it's done, it should give us a quick summary of the whole thing. So we have a React and TypeScript app, and it uses React version 19. For the UI, it uses Mountain version 9. And for routing, it uses TanStack router. It also shows an overview of the current routes, as well as the components. And it's basically just a starter project with not much to it. So far, we've seen how we can start a session, but at some point we're done and we want to exit the session. To do that, we can simply run the / command exit. And just like that, we're back in our terminal. Now, to start a new session, we've already seen how we can do that, but let's do it again. So let's run the command Claude, and that will start a new session with a clean chat history. So whenever you want to start fresh, that's how you do it. All right, now let's exit the session again. And we can do it using the slash command we saw earlier, but we can also just press Ctrl+C twice, which is a little bit faster. Now, what if we want to resume one of the older sessions? To do that, we can run the Claude command and then just add the R flag next to it, which basically stands for resume, and it will show us a list with all the sessions that were made in this project. Now, so far we've started 2 sessions. However, we only see one because it only stores sessions that actually have a chat history, which is great because otherwise it would just store empty sessions. All right, now before we resume a session, we can always preview it first by pressing the space key, and then we can either press enter to resume the session or escape to cancel it. But for now, let's just press escape, and that should bring us back to the session list. And from here, we can also rename a session by pressing Ctrl+R, and then we can type out the new name, for example, first session. So that's how you can rename a session. Now let's just go back to the terminal by pressing escape. Now let's say we just want to continue the last session we were in. Then we don't have to list all the sessions like we just did. We can also use the command Claude with the C flag, and this way we can resume the most recent session in our project. And that's basically how we can navigate between different sessions. Now, if you ever need to delete a session, there isn't really an easy way to do it from the terminal. So what you want to do is open your home folder and look for a .claude folder. And once you're inside the folder, open projects, and you should see a folder for each project. So let's open Claude Code course, and here all the sessions are saved as JSON files. So to get rid of a session, you can just delete the file. Now, what if you have more than one session? Just by looking at the file name, you can't really tell which session is which. So what you can do is change the view to details and then sort by date. So the most recent sessions are at the top, and that way it matches the session list in your terminal. And with a little bit of counting, you can find the session that you want to delete. Before we start fully using Claude Code, it's important to understand that there are limits when it comes to the usage. So we're going to take a minute or two to see how it works. So depending on your plan, you have a different token limit, and a token is basically a way to measure how much you consume. On average, you use about 1.5 tokens per word. So a sentence like hello world costs around 3 tokens. And this goes in 2 ways. So you have input tokens that you use the moment you prompt something, and you have output tokens, which is the response you get back. And that includes the length of the response, but also the reasoning steps it takes to come up with a response. Now, Claude Code offers different models you can choose from, and each one reasons in a different way. So Haiku is the fastest and cheapest model, which has lower reasoning, but it's usually good enough for simple edits. Then you got Sonnet, which is the default model and the one you use for most coding work because it's capable but also cost efficient. Next, there's Opus, which has stronger reasoning, but it's also much more expensive. So you usually only use it for complex tasks. And finally, there's also Fable, which is the most capable model, but it's also the most expensive one. Now, to see which model you're using, you can use the slash command model. And this will show you which model is currently active. And from here, you can also switch to a different model depending on the kind of work you're doing. For now, let's just cancel this by pressing escape. All right, now besides the model, there's also the slash command effort, where you can change how much effort the model puts into a response. Higher effort gives you deeper reasoning, but it also becomes slower and more expensive. And for now, we'll just leave it as it is. All right, and now we get to the most important question, which is how much you can actually use Claude Code. And unfortunately, the exact limits are not publicly available. What we do know is that the usage works on a 5-hour rolling window. So if you send your first prompt at 3 p.m., you can use Claude Code within a certain limit until 8 p.m., and then it resets and you can continue. However, there's also a weekly cap. So even if you still have usage left in your 5-hour window, once you hit the weekly limit, you can't use Claude Code anymore until it resets. And if you want, you can always check how much you used so far by using the / command usage. And this will show your usage for the current 5-hour window, which for me is at 6%, and it should reset at 2:50 a.m. And below that, there's also the usage for the current week. When you start a new session, Claude Code doesn't know anything about your project. So earlier, we asked it for a project overview, and the only way it could help us was to open the project files and read through the code to find out what the project is about. Which means every time we start a new session, we either have to re-explain our project ourselves, or it has to read through the files to get some context about the project so it can give us a useful response. Which isn't really efficient, and it can burn through a lot of tokens, especially on a large project. So what if we could keep a summary of our project inside the file, so Claude can just read from the file instead of us having to re-explain everything? Well, that's exactly what a Claude.md file is for, and we don't have to write this file from scratch either. We can just use the / command init, and it should create the file for us. So let's check it out. Let's open the Claude.md file. And here we have a summary of our project, along with other useful context, which Claude Code can use as guidance when working on the project. And if you want, you can also add your own instructions. So if you have certain rules or coding habits you want Claude to follow in this project, this is where you can add them. And it's written in Markdown, which is used to add structure to the text. And we're going to use a lot of it, so even if you're not familiar with it yet, you will get used to it by the end of the course. Now, since we're going to edit a lot of Markdown files in this course, it's a good idea to install an extension so you can preview them. So in the Extensions tab, just search for Markdown. And let's go with the first one, which is made by Yi Wang. So go ahead and install it. And once that's done, you can close the tab. And to preview this Markdown file, just press Ctrl + Shift + V. And this will open a preview tab, which shows you exactly how the file is structured. And if you don't have any experience with Markdown files, you can learn it pretty quickly by putting the two tabs next to each other and comparing the code with a preview. Alright, now if you're working solo on a project, you can use this file however you want. However, if you're working in a team, this file is usually committed as part of the project, so everyone can access it. Now, what if you have personal preferences that you don't want to make public? And in that case, you can add them in a local Claude file. And to do that, let's first close these two tabs. Alright, next in the project folder, at the root of the project, you create a new file called Claude.local.md. And inside, you just add a title, and usually you just take the file name, so Claude.local.md. And then you can add anything that is specific to the project, but shouldn't be public. And once you're done, you should also add it to your gitignore file. So down below, you add Claude.local.md. And by doing that, Git will ignore this file when you commit to GitHub. Now let me also add a comment above it like local configuration files. And that's basically how you create a local Claude file. Alright, now so far, these files are only applied to this specific project. So this is at a project scope. But we can also create a Claude file at the user scope, which is basically applied across all projects. And to do that, inside the .claude folder in your home folder, we should create a Claude.md file, And we can do that by opening the terminal in the .claude folder and running code Claude.md. So this will create the file if it doesn't already exist, and it will open it in VS Code, so we can edit it right away. So let's start by adding a title called Claude.md. And it's not necessary, but we can also add a small description like this file provides guidance to Claude Code across all projects. And below it, we can define rules or instructions that Claude should follow across all projects. And personally, I don't want Claude to add comments to the code. So I can create a section called rules and then add something like don't add code comments unless explicitly asked. Now let's preview the file, and that looks good. So we can close both files. And just to verify, we should now have a Claude file in our .claude folder. So if you ever want to change something, you can always open it from here. All right, now one important thing to know is that Claude files are only loaded at the start of every new session. So this session we started earlier has no clue about it. So let's just exit the session and create a new one by running Claude. And to check if the files are loaded, we can use the / command context, and we'll also add the all argument, so it will show all the details. Now, I've mentioned context a few times in this lesson, and context is just background information that Claude uses to give you an accurate response. And don't worry about everything you see here. We will definitely come back to it in a later lesson. For now, all you need to look at is the memory files section. And as you can see, all 3 files are loaded into the session, and Claude Code will basically read those files and use that as context before responding to your prompts. And it's not like it reads them once and remembers them. No, for every single prompt you send, it has to go and read those files. However, together these files are about 450 tokens. So does that mean that each prompt costs you an extra 450 tokens? Well, not exactly, and that's where prompt caching comes in. And the way it works is, when you send your first prompt in a new session, the Claude files get sent along with it, and that costs you the full 450 tokens. But after that, the files get cached, and for every prompt after that, Claude Code just reads them from the cache at roughly 10% of the cost. However, the files only stay cached for about an hour. And every prompt you send resets the timer. So if you're working in one go, that's good. But if you leave and come back after an hour, you'll be paying the full 450 tokens to cache the files again. Let's say we want to tell Claude to add a login button. At this point, Claude has no idea where exactly it should add the button. So we need to tell Claude Code where the button should go, and one way to do that is to simply open the file. So in the components folder, let's open the navbar file and make sure to put the cursor inside it. Now if you look in our Claude session, it should now show that it's in the navbar component. So now it knows where the login button should be added. Now before I run the prompt, I will also add that it should point to /account/login. Now let's just send the prompt. And now it asks for permission to edit the navbar file. So let's press yes. And once it's done, in the navbar component, we can see that the login button is created and the route is set to the login path. Now let's check it in the browser, and that looks good. Let's click on the button and it should take us to the login route. So this is how we can point to a file, but what if we want to be even more specific? So let's close the file first and let's open the root route. So in the routes folder, open the root file. And let's say we want to add padding around the navbar and the outlet component. Then we can just select the code. And now in the Claude session, it says that 2 lines are selected. So if we say add some padding to this, then it knows that this refers to the lines we've just selected. Now let's also add use maintain UI, so it will use the UI library instead of plain CSS. So let's send the prompt, and it asks us for permission, so let's just press yes. Now let's take a look, and it used a stack to add padding. It could have also used a box, but it doesn't matter. It's not wrong. It just makes it a vertical flex container. And it also removed the fragment. So let me also delete this import statement since we no longer need it. Now let's close the file. And if we look in the Claude session, we still see the reference to root even though we close the file. And that's because when you close a file, it will stay in the context for one more message before it disappears. But that's only if you don't open another file. If you do, the new file will take over. All right, now let's say we wanted to add a link to the login route component. Now here we can just open the file like before, but we can also just point to the file directly from our prompt by using the @ symbol followed by the path of the login file. So login.tsx, and before we send the prompt, we should also add with the text new here, create an account. And it should point to /account/register. All right, now let's send the prompt. Again, it asks for permission, so just press yes. All right, and once it's done, we can check it in the browser. And now we have a link here. Let's click on it, and it takes us to the register route. So this is how you can reference a file, and in the same way, you can also reference a folder. So in your Claude session, you just add an @ symbol followed by the path of the folder, for example, the components folder. And that way, Claude Code will have the entire folder as context. In the previous video, we saw how we can reference files in our prompt. So basically, we could also reference images. For example, you could reference an image of a UI and ask Claude Code to make something similar. And one way to do that is to just copy an image and paste it into the session by using the command Alt+V. And another way is to just use the path of the image. So in the project, under the assets folder, I've added an image of a switch for toggling between light and dark mode. And to reference it in the session, I can say create a component like @toggle example. And I want it to be added to the navbar, so I'll say add it to @navbar.tsx. And finally, I'll also add only create the UI, nothing else. Because otherwise it might go and implement everything, and we don't want that. All right, now let's just send the prompt. And it asks for permission to create the file. So just press yes. Okay, press yes again. And it created a team toggle component using a switch component and added it to the navbar. So let's see how it looks. Let's try to toggle. And that looks really good. Now let's check the code. So in the components folder, under team toggle, open the team toggle component. And it did a really good job for me. However, you might have something entirely different and your code might even be terrible. So I would say don't worry about it, because the goal is only to learn how Claude Code works, and how this project turns out is not that important. All right, with that, we can close this file, and I'll see you in the next lesson. In the previous lesson, we added a new component, and let's say we don't like the result and want to get rid of it. Then we don't have to delete everything by hand. Instead, we can just rewind the session by using the / command rewind, or we can also use a shortcut by pressing escape twice. So this is where we currently are, and we want to rewind the changes we made here. So let's go one level up and press enter. Then it asks what exactly we want to restore, only the code, the conversation, or both. Now we want both, so we just press enter, and that should bring us back. It also leaves the prompt there in case we want to edit it and run it again, but we don't need that, so we can just delete it. And to see if the code is actually restored, let's open the browser, and the toggle button should be gone. So far, everything we've done in this session, every message we sent, every response we got back, Claude stores it and uses it as context. So we don't need to re-explain everything with every prompt. And this becomes really useful in long tasks with lots of back and forth, where Claude needs to remember earlier parts of the conversation. And actually, remember is not the right word, because LLMs don't have a memory. And the way it actually works is, with every prompt we send, the entire context gets sent along with it. So that means the longer the conversation gets, the more input tokens it will use. And we can always check what's consuming our tokens by running the / command context. So in my case, the context uses almost 28,000 tokens. However, that doesn't mean it uses that many tokens with every prompt that I sent, because as I've said in an earlier lesson, Claude Code uses prompt caching. So just like how the markdown files get cached after the first prompt, everything else also gets cached. So you only pay for roughly 10% of the tokens you see here, which is just for reading from the cache. So from the 28,000 you see now, about 2,800 extra input tokens will be used on the next prompt. But as I've said earlier, and this is really important, the cache only lasts for 1 hour. So try to finish your task in one go if you can, and try not to jump back into old sessions with a lot of context, because that first prompt bag will often be really expensive. Okay, so keep that in mind. Also, with every prompt that you send, the context grows and the cost gets higher. So you should always start a new session whenever you want to move on to a new task. And this way you don't keep using context that you don't even need. All right, besides that, there's also a limit to what Claude Code can hold as context. And this is also called the context window. And for this model, it's 200,000 tokens. We are using almost 30,000, so for now we don't need to worry about that. However, when you get close to the limit, it will automatically take the entire chat history and create a summary out of it, which will free up space while preserving most of the context. And that's what the auto compact buffer is for. It's just a reserved space so Claude has room to work properly. And it's set to 33,000 tokens, so it will automatically summarize the context once it reaches 167,000 tokens. And you can also do it manually using the compact command, which we'll look at in a second. However, keep in mind that only the messages get compressed, because everything else here is essential and doesn't get compressed further. So currently, the messages use 6,300 tokens. So now, let's run the / command compact, and this will summarize everything in the conversation. And once that's done, let's run the context command again. And in my case, the messages now use 2,400 tokens, which is almost 4,000 tokens less than before. So if you want to save on input tokens, you can run the compact command whenever you want. All right, now it's also possible to clear the entire chat history. And I'm not going to do that right now, but the command for it is clear. And that's if you want to start fresh. Alright, that's it for this lesson. Now, what I suggest you do is exit the session, then run Claude with the R flag, and finally rename the session to something clearer, like context. So later, if you want to revisit this session, it will be much easier to find. Claude Code comes with all kinds of built-in tools, and if you take away all these tools, then Claude Code is just an LLM that can't do much besides answering questions. But when we ask it to analyze our code, it needs a tool to view the content of the files. That's the read tool. When we ask it to write code, it needs a tool to make changes to files, which is the edit tool. Or when we tell it to create a new component, it needs a tool to create a file. That's the write tool. And just like that, it has many other tools for different tasks. The glob tool, which is for finding files based on patterns. The grep tool, which is for searching file contents. And the bash tool for running shell commands. We also have tools for the web like web fetch, which is for getting content from a URL, and web search for searching the web. And I might have missed some, but these are the most important ones, and we will see all of them in this course. So far, Claude Code has already used a few tools, and if you remember, it always asks explicitly for our permission. And if you don't want it to keep asking for approval, you can always change that. And to do that, let's first start a new session. Then just press Shift plus Tab to switch to the Accept Edits mode. And with this enabled, it can use the Edit or Write tool without asking for permission. Now, if you want to switch to a different mode, just press Shift plus Tab again. So there's also a Plan mode. Let's press Shift plus Tab one more time. And we also have something called Auto mode, which auto approves file edits and shell commands. I personally don't like this at all, so I will choose the option, No, don't ask again. And now it's back in Plan mode, and if you press Shift plus Tab one more time, it should go back to the default mode. Now, by default, every time you start a session, it will be in the default mode. And if you want, you can change that in your project settings. To do that, at the root of your project, you create a folder called .claude, and inside it, you create a new file called settings.json. Now inside, you first add a JSON object, then a permissions key, which you set to an object. Inside it, you add a default mode key and set it to the mode that should be active when the session starts. For example, accept edits. So now every time you start a new session, it will start in the accept edits mode. Now let's see if it works. Let's end this session and start a new one. And it works as expected. Now, if you're working in a team, this file is meant for the whole team. And it's also the one that gets committed to GitHub. So here you should only have settings that apply for everyone. And what we did here is actually personal because not everyone likes it. And it's recommended to create a local settings file instead, which is called settings.local.json. And then just take the permissions from the settings file and put them here. Now let's see if it still works. Let's end the session and run it again. And it does. Now finally, we also need to add the file name to the gitignore file. So let's open the gitignore file. And down below, add settings.local.json. Now if you look, you can see that both these files have .local in the name. So instead of adding them separately, we can just use a wildcard, then .local, and then another wildcard. And this matches every file with .local. In the name, so we can remove these two lines. Alright, with that we can close this file. So this is how we can stop Claude Code from asking permission for the edit and write tools. Now what if you also want to allow it to use other tools? In that case, you can use the allow key and set it to an array where you can list all the tools that should be allowed. And you don't need to list all the tools up front, because whenever Claude Code uses a tool, it always gives you an option to allow it later. So let me show you what I mean. Let's ask Claude to build this project using npm. And to do that, it has to run a command in the terminal, and it has to use the bash tool for that. So here it asks whether it's allowed to do that. Now, if you choose the second option, then it won't ask you again. So let me just do that. And while it builds the project, let's take a look at the local settings. And as you can see, it added the bash tool, and inside the parentheses, it also shows the exact command that is allowed. So in the future, if it wants to run a command that starts with npm run, it will just do it without asking for permission. Anyway, now that you understand how permissions work, let's just delete everything in this file. And then make sure to exit the session so the changes take effect. Now, if you ever want the settings to apply to all your projects, then you should write them at the user scope by opening the .claude folder in your home folder. And here you can find a settings.json file where you can configure global settings. When you're working with Claude Code, you often find yourself writing the same instructions over and over. For example, when you want Claude to create a component, besides describing the component itself, you might also want to tell it to create a separate folder for it. Next, you might also want to mention that it should use Manton for styling, and there could be many other things that you find important. These are instructions that you would have to repeat every single time you want Claude to create a component. And that's where skills come in. And a skill is simply a file with reusable instructions that tell Claude Code how to handle a specific task. So when you ask Claude to create a component, you don't need to keep explaining the same things over and over, which makes your workflow more consistent and faster. In a React project, you will often find yourself creating React components. So in this lesson, we will create a skill that does exactly that. And to do that, inside the .claude folder, we first need to create a folder called skills, which is where all our skills will go. And to create a skill, we should first create a folder with the name of the skill, in this case, component. And then inside it, we add a new file called skill in uppercase .md. Now, each skill file should start with a YAML front matter block at the top of the file, which starts with 3 dashes and ends with another 3 dashes. And in between, we can configure things like when and how Claude should use the skill. So first of all, it must have a name, which is how it will show up in the skill listing. And we'll just go for component. Next, it should also have a description that explains what the skill does, and it's also what Claude uses to decide when to invoke the skill. So we'll set it to create a React component with Manton following the project structure conventions. Now, you can also use this field to describe when Claude should invoke the skill. However, you can also use a different field called when to use, which is made specifically for that. Now, if you're using VS Code, you probably see a warning that the attribute is not supported by VS Code agents. And that's because it assumes you're creating a skill.md file for GitHub Copilot, which doesn't support this attribute. However, Claude Code does, so you can ignore it for now, and hopefully they will fix it in the future. Anyway, here we need to add specific phrases or conditions for when Claude Code should decide to use this skill. So let's set it to use this skill when the user asks to create, add, or build a component or do anything that implies a new component is needed. Now, this field is actually optional, and you can also put everything in the description and it will still work. However, I prefer to keep them separate. All right, now in the skill body, we can set the rules and instructions that Claude should follow when creating components. And one thing I want to say right from the start is try to keep the body as short as possible, because the moment a skill gets invoked, it will stay in the context and you will pay for it on every prompt that you send after that. All right, that being said, let's start by creating a section called create the component. And below it, we say, based on the request, derive a Pascal case component name. And let's also give some examples like footer and user cart. And if you don't know what these backticks are for, these are usually used for inline code, technical terms, or just to make something stand out a bit. And as we keep writing the body, you can always press Ctrl plus Shift plus V to see exactly what everything does. All right, now, usually components consist of multiple files, such as a TSX file, a CSS file, and things like that. So it's also important to specify how everything should be structured and where each file should go. So next, we'll say structure the component as follows. And we'll start with the TSX file itself, which should be added inside source/components. And here it should create a new folder with the component name that it just came up with. So we'll add another slash, followed by a pair of angle brackets to indicate that this is a placeholder and should be replaced with a real value. So let's call it component name. So it's clear that it should replace it with the name of the component. All right, now inside this folder, it should then create the component file. So we'll add another slash, then another placeholder called component name, followed by .tsx. All right, next we should also have a CSS file, which should go inside source/components/ again, we add a placeholder called component name, then another slash, and a placeholder called component name, followed by .module.css. Finally, we also need a barrel index file, so source/components/ a placeholder called component name /index.ts. And in parentheses, we'll also say that it's a barrel file that re-exports the component preferably as the default export. And we can also add a template, so export default from / followed by a placeholder called component name. And that should be enough. Next, we should also have a section called file contents. And for each file, we'll create a subsection. And let's start with the TSX file. So we'll add a placeholder called component name.tsx. And this file holds JSX and the props interface, if applicable. And there should be no inline styles. Then we create another subsection for the CSS file. So we'll add a placeholder called component name.module.css. And this file holds component scoped styles. Now, a CSS file isn't always needed because most of the time you can do the same thing using the Manton library. So we should also tell it to skip this file if the UI can be fully built using Manton. And that way it will only create a CSS file when it's actually needed. And finally, we can also add a section called conventions for any additional rules that it should follow. For example, I want it to use Manton instead of plain CSS whenever it's possible. So we can add something like prefer Manton where possible. Next, I also noticed that sometimes it doesn't destructure the props, so we can also tell it to destructure props. And a component doesn't always have props, so we should also add where applicable. And I'll just stop there because every component is different and I really need it to be flexible. Alright, so this is it for our skill file. Really short, probably not even 100 tokens, but it has everything we need. So let's save the changes. And we're basically done here, so we can just close this file. And now we can finally test it. To do that, let's start by creating a new session. And we'll say create a black footer component with a copyright notice on the right and 2 social media icons on the left, Instagram and X. And we want it to be imported in the root route component. So we'll also add import it in at __ root.tsx. Now let's send the prompt. And that should invoke the component skill we've just created. And Claude will ask for your permission a few times. So just press yes on everything and come back once the component is created. Alright, so it created the footer component, and the root now also has a minimum height of 100 view height. So it stays at the bottom, and that's actually a good thing. So let's check it in the browser. And the footer looks good. Let's see if the icons are set up correctly. This one points to Instagram, and this one to X. Alright, so everything is working fine. However, the padding is also applied to the footer, which looks a bit ugly. So back in VS Code, under routes, let's open the root route. And first of all, I'll remove this padding, and instead I'll apply it to the navbar and outlet. And for that, I can use Manton's box component. So at the top, I'll import box. Next, below the stack component, I'll add a box component. Then place the navbar and outlet inside it. And finally, I'll add some padding to the box. So I'll set P to MD. And with that, I'm done here. So I can just close the file. Now let's check it in the browser. And now the footer has no padding, which looks much better.